In this scene, we're at a research facility as a fusion experiment for a new kind of spacecraft is being conducted. The experiment is going bad, possibly due to sabotage by the character Nigel, who's not in the scene. Before this scene, we've seen Nigel do some strange things, but we're still not convinced that he's the saboteur. The man in the suit is Howard, the financial muscle behind the operation. The experiment is very dangerous and could potentially turn into a bomb instead. Howard has bet his entire reputation on it succeeding and is a little on the edge when problems begin to arise. The red man is Raymond, the main operator. And the blue man is John, another technician, who only has a single line but is still a significant part of the scene for blocking purposes. Let's do a read-through. Raymond stares flabbergasted at the computer screen as rows of warning lights flare up.
Hang on. What the hell's going on here?
What?
The security perimeter is going down across the board.
Go find Nigel.
Okay, the power is going down.
John stops short of the door as the whole control room suddenly shuts off. They all freeze in their tracks, realizing the seriousness.
Well, get it back up. Use Nigel's terminal.
Raymond quickly rolls his chair to Nigel's screen.
Why is this one still on?
John steps forward, alarmed.
Tell me the containment field isn't down.
Nope, it's still on.
Why the hell would he turn the perimeter off?
As in the under attack scene, we're dealing with a hectic situation. So we'll try to give the scene as much flow as possible by doing constant subtle camera moves, by doing transitions like handoffs to glue together lines of dialogue, and by countering or converging. The gray character is Howard, who we've placed in the middle of the room since he's the one who came up with the money and probably doesn't know how to operate the equipment. The red character is Raymond, who we've placed by this terminal so we can later roll over to Nigel's terminal, which is here. We could place John anywhere, but we've placed him here to assist Raymond for the first half of the scene, which allows us to group them together and do fewer shots. The basic character movement comes from the script, although we'll add some more movement to create opportunities for handoffs. Since Howard is stationary in the middle of the room, his entire movement consists of turning left and right to follow the action. At some point, John walks out and stops short of the door, then turns. The script says that he steps forwards when his line comes up, but we'll be doing a slow push on him later, which will have the same effect. Also, at some point, Raymond rolls his chair over to Nigel's terminal. We'll build the blocking by first placing keyframes and then deciding on how to connect them. In the beginning, we would need a shot on the monitor and then one on Raymond. Later, when the control room shuts down, we would need to be back on the monitor as it turns off, and since we don't need these shots at the same time, let's immediately combine them on a track. The result is that we start on the monitor and track around to Raymond. We could then just sit here, and when the monitors go bad, track back around to the monitor again. But since we're looking for opportunities to do slow pushes, let's start the return move right away, resulting in a slow push on Raymond and ending by suddenly panning around to the monitors. To remember how we intend to use this track, we'll label the stops 1, 2, and 3. To look for some other keyframes, we'll want a shot on Howard for his dialogue with Raymond. It could also be interesting to cut wide just as all the monitors turn off, so let's place a keyframe for that here. When John has walked to the door, we'll also want a shot on him, but this is where we want to do a slow push for his realization. So let's add a starting keyframe for that, which we intend to connect on a track. Outside the door, there's presumably a wall, which can make the shot sort of flat, so to add some more depth, we'll place an extra outside who'll maybe be a guard. A pattern that's emerging here is that for the last half of the scene, we have the potential for several staggered deep staging shots. Starting out here, we have one with Raymond in the foreground and Howard, John, and the extra staggered in the background. Howard's lock shot is probably framed with him to the left for the beginning of the scene. But if we reframe this camera when John walks to the door, it'll become a staggered deep staging shot with John and the extra in the background. We'll write the reframing out here to know that it relates to John's movement in the background. Since this is where the characters stand in the last half of the scene, we can easily cover this section of the script by cutting closer or wider between these three cameras, at the same time avoiding any line considerations. Looking again at the widest of these cameras, we'll need this as soon as Raymond has rolled his chair to Nigel's terminal. The wide shot we placed here was used immediately before as the monitors failed. If we combine these on a track, the result will be a sort of counter-converge as Raymond rolls his chair over. However, this move will be pretty fast, and we're also moving very close behind the monitors, which might make the move seem very sudden. So let's shorten the move by moving the wide keyframe a little closer. In the beginning, we'll still get a fairly wide shot, and the shorter travel will make the move fit better into the scene. While we're in this area, Raymond asks why Nigel's terminal is still on. We ought to show Nigel's monitor as well, so let's place a keyframe here for that. The last big construction area is up by John and the door. With John moving behind Howard, we have some excellent opportunities for handoff since their dialogue is consecutive. So at the end of the scene, before Howard asks why Nigel would turn the perimeter off, let's have John walk back to the control panel and track with him into essentially the same keyframe as Howard's lock camera. This will result in a tracking handoff to Howard, and since we're reusing Howard's keyframe, and since all the keyframes are pretty much in line, let's combine them on a track. But Howard has dialogue throughout the scene and will still need a full lock take on him. So let's place an L by this keyframe, and update the reframe with another L to show that it relates to the lock version. The tracking version then starts on this stop and pushes in slowly on John by the door. We'll work out the exact timing of when he turns and when he talks while we're shooting it. When he walks back to the console, we track with him, handing off to Howard for his last line. The scene is now over, but let's find a way to integrate a prop we've had made for this scene, which is a poster about the safety of fusion technology. If we hang the poster on the wall over here, we can have Howard walk over to the console as well and do an ironic handoff to the poster. In order to not have this handoff be on the nose, let's place another console over here with some extra technicians, which will make it seem like a more casual part of the scene. Let's look at the takes. The result of this blocking is 3 tracks and 1 lock camera. We're drawing the lock take on Howard as a separate lock camera, even though it will technically be shot with a track that leads towards the door to John. So to look at each of the cameras, the first is the one that starts on the monitor, tracks around to Raymond, and slowly back again. In the beginning, it's simply a start-on reveal which we'll use to open the scene. Here we had the choice of holding on Raymond and going back on the monitor at the last minute. But to get the general effect of constant slow pushes, we immediately begin pushing in on Raymond for the duration of his dialogue here. And at the very end, where we're almost back in the original keyframe, we pan back on the monitors as they fail, which is where the take ends.
Hang on. What the hell's going on here?
What?
The security perimeter is going down across the board.
Go find Nigel.
Okay, the power is going down.
Throughout the take, we'll keep focus on whatever is the subject of the shot. The lock take on Howard is technically mounted on a track, but this is more a matter of convenience since we could just as well shoot it on a tripod. This camera belongs to Howard throughout the scene, and we'll keep focus on him throughout as well. The only direction for this camera is that we keep Howard in the left side of the frame while the dialogue is to the right. And when John walks to the door, we reframe Howard to the right, creating a staggered deep staging shot with the extra in the background.
Hang on. What the hell's going on here?
What?
The security perimeter is going down across the board.
Go find Nigel.
Okay, the power is going down.
Well, get it back up. Use Nigel's terminal.
We're doing the handoffs in the tracking version, so we'll cut here. The tracking version of this camera has a little more to do. The first move is pushing in on John by the door as he realizes that disaster would strike if the containment field went down. The timing for this part of the shot is pretty arbitrary. We just want to be pushing while he turns, and later while he has his line. Since the last half of the shot has very specific timing, we might want to break the take up here, which we can do because we're cutting away to Raymond for his line before John begins walking again. So starting a pickup take, we track with John as he walks back to the console, doing a tracking handoff on Howard and racking focus to him as well. After his line, he also has an arbitrary movement over to the console, which we're just doing to have a reason for handing off to the poster, and again racking focus to that.
Well, get it back up. Use Nigel's terminal.
Why is this one still on?
Tell me the containment field isn't down.
Nope, it's still on.
Why the hell would he turn the perimeter off?
The next camera is the one that starts out as a wide master, which will be great for showing the whole control room having turned off. We'll leave the camera running throughout the beginning, but we might only cut to it once in this position. As Raymond rolls his chair over, we converge or counter, which will both add drama and bring us into a great staggered deep staging shot here. Since we're cutting dialogue between this camera, Howard's, and John's pushing close shot, we'll leave it running. But as John walks back to the console, we might as well cut since we'll be in the tracking handoff camera.
Hang on. What the hell's going on here?
What?
The security perimeter is going down across the board.
Go find Nigel.
Okay, the power is going down.
Well, get it back up. Use Nigel's terminal.
Why is this one still on?
Tell me the containment field isn't down.
Nope, it's still on.
Throughout the take, we'll keep focus on Raymond. The final camera is the insert on Nigel's monitor. It'll be interesting to see in editing where we can fit it in, because the best time to cut to it is also the time where we counter on Raymond, which is a far more preferable take. So we'll probably go to it before or after Raymond rolls over, but not for his actual movement. Still, it's a take that provides a lot of information about what Nigel might be doing, so we definitely need it in there. Let's view the cut.
Hang on. What the hell's going on here?
What?
The security perimeter is going down across the board.
Go find Nigel.
Okay, the power is going down.
Well, get it back up. Use Nigel's terminal.
Why is this one still on?
Tell me the containment field isn't down.
Nope, it's still on.
Why the hell would he turn the perimeter off?
The next scene takes place in a courtroom during a custody battle. Martin, the blue man, has over a period of 5 years abandoned his family to live a self-indulgent and irresponsible lifestyle with a variety of girlfriends. His wife Karen, the blue woman, has somehow held out hope that he would come back, but has finally been preparing to divorce. What has happened now is that Martin has found out that his estranged father is dying and is leaving millions of dollars to Martin's children instead of to him, so Martin has suddenly shown up to try to get custody. The red woman is Karen's attorney, Mrs. Rawlings, and both her and Karen know nothing about this. The red man is Martin's attorney, Hayden. Let's do a read-through. Rawlings addresses Martin.
Mr. Sanford, were you in any way forced out of your home or pressured by your wife to leave?
No.
I'm sure we can all see the logic of why Mr. Sanford, without any prior warning, would leave his wife and children to go off somewhere and vanish for 5 years.
Objection.
Mr. Sanford, now that you suddenly and out of the blue have returned to Chicago, do you plan to be a responsible parent?
Yes, I do.
How can you expect anyone to believe you, given that you abandoned your own children?
I don't know. Does it matter? They are still my children. I made a mistake, but now I want to be there for them, 100%.
Well, do you, Mr. Sanford? Will you please tell us all how you came to the conclusion that you all of a sudden are ready for that kind of commitment? Did your many affairs leave you lonely? Your last girlfriend ditched you less than a month ago, isn't that correct, Mr. Sanford?
Hayden jumps up from his seat.
Objection.
Overruled. The witness will answer the question.
That has nothing to do with it.
And isn't it true, Mr. Sanford, that your constant philandering has started to bore you and that responsible parenting is nothing but your latest fad?
Objection.
Objection sustained. Please rephrase the question, Mrs. Rawlings.
Mr. Sanford, is your wish to resume your role as a responsible parent a fad?
No!
Mr. Sanford, how can you expect this court to grant you full custody of 2 children you barely know? Your wife is and has been an excellent mother, so doesn't that strike you as a crazy demand? And I don't recall you having pled temporary insanity. At least not yet.
Objection! Stop harassing the witness!
Sustained. Please make your point.
No further questions, Your Honour.
The witness may be excused.
Rawlings sits down next to Karen.
Did you really have to ridicule him like that?
If you want to keep full custody of your children, Mrs. Sanford.
Martin gets down from the witness stand and walks to the prosecution's table, momentarily exchanging looks with Karen. Courtroom scenes can be some of the more difficult to block because we have rapid dialogue between characters scattered across the scene and at least one character moving around heavily. But given everything we've looked at, it can actually be quite easy to block a scene like this simply by drawing in the stops for the moving characters and examining the line consequences in slow motion. In this scene, both Karen, the prosecuting attorney, and the judge are seated throughout. Martin is on the witness stand for most of the scene, and Rawlings is mainly in the area in front of Martin. So to decide on a couple of basic strategies, the first will be that the action mainly happens within this triangle. The only characters outside this triangle are the judge and the jury, which we can easily cover from within. Or alternatively, cross the line as we would have with an L shape, which is okay because we don't really know how far back we are. Another basic strategy that could be interesting is to have Rawlings primarily move between 2 marks placed like this, creating 2 mirrored lines. If we then place an over-the-shoulder here, a close-up on Martin, and a reverse close-up on Rawlings, she can move between the marks indefinitely, and all 3 cameras will stay good throughout as long as we reframe to keep the space on the better side. This arrangement of cameras will then constantly be producing line crosses, which essentially divides the scene in half, giving us access to this half of the scene when Rawlings is in this position, and this half of the scene when she's in this position. Some other marks that could be interesting to create for Rawlings are first of all one in front of the jury. To cover this, we can simply pan each of the reframing cameras to follow, which means that each of them will produce takes that are useful almost throughout the scene. An added benefit, at least in this camera, is that following Rawlings from the jury and back to Martin results in ending in a keyframe. Another interesting stop could be here, because we could frame a camera with Karen in the background as Rawlings talks about her. And this stop could again also be covered by panning with Rawlings in this camera, so we have 2 shot sizes of that. A less obvious use of one of the stops we've already set is that in this position we'll probably be able to frame this camera to get Hayden in the background. Much of what Rawlings talks about seems to be meant to irritate the prosecution, and getting Hayden in the background will give us a built-in reaction shot. But a consideration is that for Rawlings' 2 stops here, we want to frame for the space closest to Martin, which is most comfortable for dialogue. However, to get Hayden in the background, we need to frame for the space behind her. So let's primarily frame the shot right, and then frame for Hayden the times we want to show his reaction. We would also need a close-up on Hayden, which we'll probably usually cut to from one of these cameras. A thing we get for free here is that Rawlings' movement creates 2 lines here, and as long as we place Hayden's close-up sandwiched between them, we'll be able to use it regardless of which side of the line we're on. But a thing we might want to plan for is that Hayden often stands up and sits down as he yells objection. If we're this close, we'll be tilting hard up and down, and one of his heights will therefore be an extremely high or low angle. So let's move his close-up further away and use a longer focal length, which requires much less change in angle to follow him. Now would be a good time to find out the timing of Rawlings' movement between the marks. But before we do that, one move that could be interesting to open the scene with is to start close on Martin with Rawlings outside the frame. Then open the space and have Rawlings step in. But we'll still need a close-up on Martin, so let's note a lock take for the starting position. Rawlings also ultimately ends up walking back to her seat, at which point we could close the space again, resulting in a close push on Martin. We don't really know where in the script this is going to land, so let's decide when shooting it whether or not it feels motivated. If not, we can just leave the camera wide. The scene then starts with Rawlings coming from outside the frame, stepping to Mark II as she cross-examines and we open the space. Besides that, we simply want to create some arbitrary movement, and our only concern is to end on Mark 1 when we want to get Hayden in the background. Let's first have her stand in front of the jury fairly soon to reveal them. For her next line, we'll have her walk back to Mark 2. Here we'll simply do a bunch of movement between Marks 1 and 2, timed to her lines to make her drive the scene. So here we'll move back to Mark 1, then to Mark 2, and back to Mark 1 just in time for Hayden to call objection in the background, for which we might cut to his close-up as well. A little later we'll have her walk to Mark 2 again, and later back to Mark 1. For the line where she mentions Karen more than anywhere else, she'll walk to Mark 4, which is in front of her. Here she can do her last bit of questioning, after which she walks to the defense's table and sits down, which will be a Mark 5. Her movement is then back and forth between Marks 1, 2, and 3, one way to Mark 4, and ends on a new Mark 5 by the table. With this as the basic structure, let's put in some more cameras, starting with a camera on the judge before we forget. Another good camera would be a shot on Karen, set up as a close push to get the feeling of listening. Karen has no lines until the end, so this would be a generic shot we could just do for 20 seconds and cut to when we want. Likewise, we could do a slow sideways track on the jury to show them listening, which again has no time reference, so we'll simply shoot 20 seconds we can cut to at will. We don't really have any wide shots in the scene. One option would be a wide over the shoulder behind Karen, which would be easy to get to, first of all when the line is here, and secondly when the line is here. Another option would be a slow push down to the right, which captures the questioning with the jury slightly in the foreground and would work when the line is here, or here. We would either have to do a slow push for 2 minutes, but we could just as well simply pick the times to be in the camera and push then. In the beginning, when Rawlings is on Mark 3 by the jury, we're already planning to be in the other cameras, so it would have to be sometime Rawlings is on Mark 1. Let's do it during Martin's line here, which is a little long and could use an interesting cut. A second time we might want to be in this camera is towards the end, when the judge says the witness may be excused. Whether we're doing a push at this point is optional, but it would be a useful time to be back in this angle. Near the end, when Rawlings is sat down, we would need some reverses for dialogue. We'll place the first one here to capture both the defense and the prosecution tables. If Martin's walk from the witness stand then ends here, we would be able to get him in the background, which might create interesting tension between the characters. The other reverse would then be a mirror. We could use the ending position of Karen's push for this angle, but we want the push to be near the other cameras or the angle could get a little hard. And the coverage also seems a little more structured if these cameras match, so let's do a short lock take. Prior to this, Rawlings is on Mark 4 and the line is here. For covering her walk to Mark 5, we could start in this camera and track around to the first reverse, which could be a classy move that would get us to the other side of the line. We could then time Martin's arrival to after their brief dialogue, which would give us time to have the characters send each other looks. Let's look at the takes. The result of this blocking is 11 cameras, of which 5 are on tracks. However, the lock camera here is the locked version of the camera that pulls out from Martin, so technically it's 10 setups. If you want to practice editing a scene with a lot of line issues, this scene is good to experiment with, so we'll again play the full takes of each camera. The first camera is the one that pulls out from Martin and opens the space as Rawlings steps in. The next specific move is that we pan with Rawlings as she walks over to the jury. She turns, and we pan back to the dialogue, ending in an over the shoulder again. For the next long stretch, the camera simply reframes for whichever side of the line Rawlings puts us on. And finally, as she walks to Mark 4, we close the space again, resulting in a push. Throughout the take, we'll keep focus on Martin, except that we'll rack focus to Rawlings for her walk to the jury, and back on Martin as she walks back.
Mr. Sanford, were you in any way forced out of your home or pressured by your wife to leave?
No.
I'm sure we can all see the logic of why Mr. Sanford, without any prior warning, would leave his wife and children to go off somewhere and vanish for 5 years.
Objection.
Mr. Sanford, now that you suddenly and out of the blue have returned to Chicago, do you plan to be a responsible parent?
Yes, I do.
How can you expect anyone to believe you given that you abandoned your own children?
I don't know. Does it matter? They are still my children. I made a mistake, but now I want to be there for them. 100%.
Well, do you, Mr. Sanford? Will you please tell us all how you came to the conclusion that you all of a sudden are ready for that kind of commitment? Did your many affairs leave you lonely? Your last girlfriend ditched you less than a month ago, isn't that correct, Mr. Sanford?
Objection!
Overruled. The witness will answer the question.
That has nothing to do with it.
And isn't it true, Mr. Sanford, that your constant philandering has started to bore you and that responsible parenting is nothing but your latest fad?
Objection!
Objection sustained. Please rephrase the question, Mrs. Rawlings.
Mr. Sanford, is your wish to resume your role as a responsible parent a fad?
No!
Mr. Sanford, how can you expect this court to grant you full custody of two children you barely know? Your wife is and has been an excellent mother, so doesn't that strike you as a crazy demand?
The lock version of this camera stays a close-up on Martin throughout and is framed at a slightly different height, which is easy to do between takes. The only thing this camera does is reframe to move the space to the left or right.
Mr. Sanford, were you in any way forced out of your home or pressured by your wife to leave?
No.
I'm sure we can all see the logic of why Mr. Sanford, without any prior warning, would leave his wife and children to go off somewhere and vanish for 5 years.
Objection!
Mr. Sanford, now that you suddenly and out of the blue have returned to Chicago, do you plan to be a responsible parent?
Yes, I do.
How can you expect anyone to believe you given that you abandoned your own children?
I don't know. Does it matter? They are still my children. I made a mistake, but now I want to be there for them. 100%.
Well, do you, Mr. Sanford? Will you please tell us all how you came to the conclusion that you all of a sudden are ready for that kind of commitment? Did your many affairs leave you lonely? Your last girlfriend ditched you less than a month ago, isn't that correct, Mr. Sanford?
Objection!
Overruled. The witness will answer the question.
That has nothing to do with it.
And isn't it true, Mr. Sanford, that your constant philandering has started to bore you and that responsible parenting is nothing but your latest fad?
Objection!
Objection sustained. Please rephrase the question, Mrs. Rawlings.
Mr. Sanford, is your wish to resume your role as a responsible parent a fad?
No!
Mr. Sanford, how can you expect this court to grant you full custody of two children you barely know?
The next camera is the internal close-up on Rawlings, which again mainly reframes. In the beginning, we'll frame the shot for her ending position and have her step into it. We'll mainly keep focus on her, except when she walks to the jury, for which it would make sense to nudge focus to them, and back on her as she turns around. She then walks back, and the camera spends the next 2 minutes simply reframing. The only detail is that we're making sure to get Hayden in the background for a couple of lines we'll select before shooting. So skipping to the end, this camera pans with Rawlings to mark 4 out in the room, for which we also have a closer lock camera to cut with.
Mr. Sanford, were you in any way forced out of your home or pressured by your wife to leave?
No.
I'm sure we can all see the logic of why Mr. Sanford, without any prior warning, would leave his wife and children to go off somewhere and vanish for 5 years.
Objection!
Mr. Sanford, now that you suddenly and out of the blue have returned to Chicago, do you plan to be a responsible parent?
Yes, I do.
How can you expect anyone to believe you given that you abandoned your own children?
I don't know. Does it matter? They are still my children. I made a mistake, but now I want to be there for them. 100%.
Well, do you, Mr. Sanford? Will you please tell us all how you came to the conclusion that you all of a sudden are ready for that kind of commitment? Did your many affairs leave you lonely? Your last girlfriend ditched you less than a month ago, isn't that correct, Mr. Sanford?
Objection!
Overruled. The witness will answer the question.
That has nothing to do with it.
And isn't it true, Mr. Sanford, that your constant philandering has started to bore you and that responsible parenting is nothing but your latest fad?
Objection!
Objection sustained. Please rephrase the question, Mrs. Rawlings.
Mr. Sanford, is your wish to resume your role as a responsible parent a fad?
No!
Mr. Sanford, how can you expect this court to grant you full custody of two children you barely know? Your wife is and has been an excellent mother, so doesn't that strike you as a crazy demand? And I don't recall you having pled temporary insanity. At least not yet.
Objection! Stop harassing the witness!
Sustained. Please make your point.
No further questions, Your Honour.
The witness may be excused.
Moving on to Hayden's close-up, we placed the camera further back with a longer lens so we wouldn't have to tilt his heart up and down to follow him. Since he's the only person in the shot, let's not do a full take, but instead shoot him wild with his lines much closer together. The only thing we need to be sure to get is some general reaction to cut with, and also shots of him turning his head to follow Rawlings during her major stage business.
Objection. Objection! 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 Stop harassing the witness!
Similar to Hayden's camera, the judge also only has a few lines, which will shoot wild and again make sure to get him turning his head to follow Rawlings.
Mr. Sanford, were you in any way forced out of your home or pressured by your wife to leave?
Objection. Objection!
Overruled. The witness will answer the question.
Objection!
Objection sustained. Please rephrase the question, Mrs. Rawlings.
Objection! Stop harassing the witness!
Sustained. Please make your point. The witness may be excused.
Karen's close push is again a generic reaction shot. She has no lines here, so this take is additionally without sound. A 10 to 20 second push should give us enough to be able to cut to her a couple of times for listening. The sideways track on the jury is also a generic take. As with the judge's camera, we don't have to be that worried about which side of the line we're on. Like with the L shape, the same shot could be produced from further back using a longer focal length, so it doesn't feel like a line cross even if it is. The wide shot in the corner shoots the actual action, which is why we picked a certain point to do a slow push. We'll simply start the track 10 seconds before the moment we're going for and roll a little after.
Yes, I do.
How can you expect anyone to believe you given that you abandoned your own children?
I don't know. Does it matter? They are still my children. I made a mistake, but now I want to be there for them. 100%.
Well, do you, Mr. Sanford? Will you please tell us all how you came to the conclusion that you all of a sudden are ready for that kind of commitment?
We also had the idea of cutting wide as the judge excuses Martin, so let's shoot a lock take to cover that.
No further questions, Your Honour.
The witness may be excused.
Before we move on to the ending, let's look at the close-up on Rawlings while she's on Mark IV. The close-up on her from the witness stand has already panned with her, so this is essentially the close version.
Mr. Sanford, how can you expect this court to grant you full custody of two children you barely know? Your wife is and has been an excellent mother, so doesn't that strike you as a crazy demand? And I don't recall you having pled temporary insanity. At least not yet.
Objection! Stop harassing the witness!
Sustained. Please make your point.
No further questions, Your Honour.
The witness may be excused. The
ending starts in the over-the-shoulder behind Karen. We could have shot a full take here as well, but we already have so many cameras it feels like a waste of time. The camera tracks as Rawlings walks over, ending on the opposite side of the line and with a clear view to the prosecution in the background. Focus for this shot is mainly on Rawlings. But when Martin eventually steps into the background, we could rack focus to him as he and Karen exchange awkward looks.
No further questions, Your Honour.
The witness may be excused.
Did you really have to ridicule him like that?
If you want to keep full custody of your children, Mrs. Sanford.
The last camera is the matching reverse. This camera also starts out on the right side of the line, so we could also cover the line cross from here, although the matching reverse that tracks is far nicer. For this angle, we'll leave focus on Karen.
Did you really have to ridicule him like that?
If you want to keep full custody of your children, Mrs. Sanford.
Let's view the cut.
Mr. Sanford, were you in any way forced out of your home or pressured by your wife to leave?
No.
I'm sure we can all see the logic of why Mr. Sanford, without any prior warning, would leave his wife and children to go off somewhere and vanish for 5 years.
Objection.
Mr. Sanford, now that you suddenly and out of the blue have returned to Chicago, do you plan to be a responsible parent?
Yes, I do.
How can you expect anyone to believe you, given that you abandoned your own children?
I don't know. Does it matter? They are still my children. I made a mistake, but now I want to be there for them, 100%.
Well, do you, Mr. Sanford? Will you please tell us all how you came to the conclusion that you all of a sudden are ready for that kind of commitment? Did your many affairs leave you lonely? Your last girlfriend ditched you less than a month ago, isn't that correct, Mr. Sanford?
Objection.
Overruled. The witness will answer the question.
That has nothing to do with it.
And isn't it true, Mr. Sanford, that your constant philandering has started to bore you and that responsible parenting is nothing but your latest fad?
Objection.
Objection sustained. Please rephrase the question, Mrs. Rawlings.
Mr. Sanford, is your wish to resume your role as a responsible parent a fad?
No!
Mr. Sanford, how can you expect this court to grant you full custody of 2 children you barely know? Your wife is and has been an excellent mother, so doesn't that strike you as a crazy demand? And I don't recall you having pled temporary insanity. At least not yet.
Objection. Stop harassing the witness.
Sustained. Please make your point.
No further questions, Your Honour.
The witness may be excused.
Did you really have to ridicule him like that?
If you want to keep full custody of your children, Mrs. Sanford.
This scene is between Samantha, the CEO of a huge corporation, and Anthony, a young intern. Prior to this point in the story, Samantha and Anthony have had a heated affair, even though he's only half her age. The problem now is that while she thought that the affair was just a little fling, maybe something she did to feel youthful again, Anthony takes it much more personally. In his young mind, this is a real relationship. They have a great future together and might even one day get married. As Samantha has realized what would happen to her career if the world found out about her escapade, she's sobered up pretty quickly and is now all about damage control. Let's do a read-through. The rain beats the window pane. Anthony is sitting on a sofa. Samantha is walking around restlessly.
Just for the record, I didn't come on to you. You came on to me.
I most certainly did not.
Did too.
Did not.
Did too.
We can't handle this like babies, Anthony.
What's there to handle?
You know just as well as I that this can never happen.
You didn't like it?
Samantha sits down opposite Anthony.
I didn't say I didn't like it.
You didn't act like someone who didn't like it.
Anthony, I need you to not tell anyone about this.
Why not?
You just can't.
You're gonna have to do better than that.
Anthony, I'm happily married. I have 2 children. I'm CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation. This wouldn't look good on my resume.
Anthony gets up and walks around agitated.
Well, crap. You should have thought of this a little sooner. Is this some standard corporate procedure? Bring in the up-and-comer, mess around with his feelings, and then issue a gag order? What about me, huh? Where do I fit in?
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, you're sorry, all right. Just for the wrong reasons.
I made a terrible mistake, okay?
He's not used to being labeled a terrible mistake.
Anthony, if people find out, I'm ruined. The stock will plummet, I'll be forced to resign, my family will break up, I'll have to sell my house. I'll lose everything. I can't believe that's what you want.
He's still angry, but that's a heavy consequence.
I should blackmail the hell out of you.
I'm hoping you won't.
In this scene, there are many opportunities for motivated character movement, so let's first look at the underlying motivations. The scene follows a certain melody that in the first half, Samantha thinks she can deal with this by talking down to Anthony like she would with a child. She's essentially trying to intimidate him into giving up this relationship idea, and even though the script says she's walking around because of discomfort, control is also clearly a motivation. In either case, it'll produce the same movement. But the character who has the power is really Anthony, because if he decides to go public, the consequence is entirely for her. So she'll be doing most of her moving in the first half until she realizes this. In the first half, Anthony is sitting on this sofa, which is written in the script, but also makes sense because having him sit calmly while she walks around foreshadows a superior position. Ultimately, Samantha will end up opposite him, so let's build the scene forwards and backwards from this point. In the beginning, the script again says that the rain is beating on the window, and whether or not this is written, starting on the window and pulling out would be a good move. We could then have Samantha start here and move into the shot as we open the space. But since their dialogue goes rapidly back and forth for the first half minute, we have the possibility of a really elegant move. If Samantha walks around in a circle like this, we could create a shot that continuously opens the space. Pick up on Samantha as she steps in, hand off to Anthony, and then again pick up on Samantha as she makes it around to the front, ending here. This move will cover a good stretch of dialogue, ending with the line, "We can't handle this like babies, Anthony." After this, we need to have Samantha end up over here, which we could break up into a couple of stops and use as another opportunity to base her movement on control. Her next line is, "You know just as well as I that this can never happen," which would become more dominating by having her move to stand in front of him. For her next line, she becomes serious and asks Anthony not to tell anyone. It would work great for this line to have her sit down calmly and controllingly before saying it. To cover this section of the scene, let's first cover them where they are now. Instead of putting in a series of close-ups and reverses, an experiment we could try here is basing the coverage on groupings to show relationship. We would then do a single shot on Samantha to make her more separate, and an over-the-shoulder on Anthony because he believes there's a relationship. That's maybe reading a little too much into it, but let's see if it works. Working backwards in time to Samantha's previous stop, her close-up could still work for this mark if we simply started here and pan with her as she walks over and sits down. If the height of this camera is set for the ending keyframe, we would additionally be looking up at her in the beginning, which would add to the feeling of control. For a shot on Anthony while the line is here, we would need a second reverse on him. This keyframe has essentially the same function as the later reverse, so we could connect them on a track to create a reframing reverse that basically adapts to the movement of the line. But since we're planning on being in Samantha's close-up while she walks, we would never use this shot and it would be a wasted effort. So let's count on this camera being a lock shot and only shoot the bit of dialogue that happens with the line here. More importantly, Anthony's reverse won't work while Samantha is still standing because she would be in the middle of his shot. So here we would need a closer keyframe that reframes backwards as she sits down. The next major movement is that Anthony stands up and walks around. At this point, Anthony is the character with the most power and also the most emotion, so he'll be doing all the movement from now on. For this part, he gets angry, so let's start his movement by having him walk to the window, both to become more private and to punish her. And by the end of his speech, which is the most intense, have him turn and step forwards, which is motivated by control or territory. But when a character charges at another character and then just stands there, we often get the feeling that he doesn't know what to do, which takes away from his power. So as Anthony says, "Yeah, you're sorry, all right, just for the wrong reasons," let's have him walk calmly back and look out the window. To cover this, a couple of things that could be interesting to do are, first of all, to pivot on Samantha to follow his walk. The pivot would start in the over-the-shoulder on Anthony, and the ending keyframe would be here. So the total movement for this camera is then to be here while Samantha is standing, reframe back as she sits down, and pivot as Anthony walks to the window. This can become a very rich shot if Samantha keeps facing away as Anthony walks, creating a shot with her in the foreground. Keeping her facing away from both Anthony and us also helps make her less honest or sincere, which will add an interesting depth to her character in this part of the scene. Additionally, the move will probably start with focus on Anthony from the over-the-shoulder. But as he walks, rack focus to her, so this effectively becomes her shot after the pivot. In this part of the scene, the line is here. So let's put in a close-up for when he's facing her, which will be his shot for cutting dialogue with the previous camera where he's out of focus. This camera will simply pan slightly to follow his movement. Let's also place a single shot on Anthony for when he's by the window, which will additionally frame for the space on the right side of him to separate him more from her. As one of the last lines, Samantha begins opening up as she pleads with Anthony to understand what will happen if people find out. Here we'll probably want her to turn towards him, which will also show her trying to regain the intimacy or at least some level of understanding. At this point, the pivot camera becomes irregular over the shoulder and we can't see her face. So let's cut it and continue her coverage from the single shot here. Since Samantha is both opening up and explaining the consequence, this would be a good time for a close push, so let's push this camera for the duration of her line. In deciding what to do with Anthony for the remainder of the scene, if we wanted him to move, we would probably have him walk to this mark again since it's already covered. But the scene will actually end stronger if he stays turned away from her, so we'll leave him by the window. Especially at the end, there's a very disconnected feeling between them, and it would work well to get a wide shot of the entire room. We'll additionally make sure this is a wide-angle lens to make them smaller and the room bigger for a more empty feeling. Let's look at the takes. The result of this blocking is 4 lock cameras and 3 on tracks. The 2 tracking shots on the right are on a boom in order to get in over the table and the sofa. An easier way to shoot this camera would be to just be on a dolly and remove the sofa for this angle. By the same token, this camera really doesn't need to be on a boom and could just as easily be shot on a dolly. Starting with the camera that opens the scene, this shot pulls out from the window and continuously opens the space while handing off between the characters. So as we pull out, we pick up on Samantha, hand off to Anthony, pick up on Samantha, and end here, which is where the take ends. We'll simply rack focus for each handoff.
Just for the record, I didn't come on to you, you came on to me.
I most certainly did not.
Did too.
Did not.
Did too.
We can't handle this like babies, Anthony.
The next camera is the one we put in to have a reverse on Anthony for the short time the line is in this position.
We can't handle this like babies, Anthony.
What's there to handle?
You know just as well as I that this can never happen.
The next camera is the single shot on Samantha, which is a long take. The shot was initially created as a close-up for when she's sitting. And the pan into that keyframe and the later close push are really lead-ins and extensions extrapolated from that. We'll probably cut to this camera immediately after the opening, and the angle will work for all lines in the scene. Because the level is set for when she's sitting, this is where we get the added benefit of shooting up on her, which makes emotional sense for this part of the scene. As she sits down and we tilt with her, we're then in the original keyframe. We'll leave this camera running throughout the dialogue, even though the second half is covered better from the pivoting camera over here. But in case something goes wrong, we have this as a backup. With Anthony having moved back and forth over on the right, the last thing this camera does is push in on her during the most sincere lines towards the end.
We can't handle this like babies, Anthony.
What's there to handle?
You know just as well as I that this can never happen.
You didn't like it?
I didn't say I didn't like it.
You didn't act like someone who didn't like it?
Anthony, I need you to not tell anyone about this.
Why not?
You just can't.
You're gonna have to do better than that.
Here Samantha stays the same until the close push, so let's fast forward. Anthony is now by the window.
Yeah, you're sorry, all right. Just for the wrong reasons.
I made a terrible mistake, okay? Anthony, if people find out, I'm ruined. The stock will plummet, I'll be forced to resign, my family will break up, I'll have to sell my house. I'll lose everything. I can't believe that's what you want.
I should blackmail the hell out of you.
I'm hoping you won't.
The pivoting camera is probably the richest camera in the scene and is active as soon as she crosses the line to stand opposite Anthony. The keyframe here is the one we added to adjust the framing for while she's standing. And when she sits down, we reframe backwards. Here we stay for a while, and the next thing that happens is the pivot when Anthony walks to the window. So far, focus has been on Anthony, but halfway through the move we'll rock focus to Samantha and make this her shot for the rest of the scene. This will create a very meaningful deep staging shot with her in the foreground, and having her face sideways to both Anthony and us makes her appear either insincere or ashamed. For Anthony's minor movement, we'll simply adjust the framing to follow.
What's there to handle?
You know just as well as I that this can never happen.
You didn't like it?
I didn't say I didn't like it.
You didn't act like someone who didn't like it?
Anthony, I need you to not tell anyone about this.
Why not?
You just can't.
You're gonna have to do better than that.
Anthony, I'm happily married. I have 2 children. I'm CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation. This wouldn't look good on my resume.
Well, crap. You should have thought of this a little sooner. Is this some standard corporate procedure? Bring in the up-and-comer, mess around with his feelings, and then issue a gag order? What about me, huh? Where do I fit in?
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, you're sorry, all right. Just for the wrong reasons.
I made a terrible mistake, okay? Anthony, if people find out, I'm ruined.
With Anthony out of focus in the last half of the previous shot, this camera will be his close-up. All the camera does is reframe as he moves back and forth between his 2 marks by the window. Focus is continuously on him.
Well, crap. You should have thought of this a little sooner. Is this some standard corporate procedure? Bring in the up-and-comer, mess around with his feelings, and then issue a gag order? What about me, huh? Where do I fit in?
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, you're sorry, all right. Just for the wrong reasons.
I made a terrible mistake, okay?
The next camera is a similar camera at a right angle for when he's facing out the window. Another option for this camera would have been to place it outside the window shooting inwards, but this would create a suddenly very different feeling. It would also require the set to be built almost full circle.
Well, crap. You should have thought of this a little sooner. Is this some standard corporate procedure? Bring in the up-and-comer, mess around with his feelings, and then issue a gag order? What about me, huh? Where do I fit in?
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, you're sorry, all right. Just for the wrong reasons.
I made a terrible mistake, okay?
After getting a bit of generic reaction here, let's simply skip ahead to his last line.
I should blackmail the hell out of you.
I'm hoping you won't.
The last camera is the master we plan on cutting to at the end. Most shots so far have used 80 to 100 millimeter lenses to get a tighter atmosphere, but the point of this shot is to create an empty feeling towards the end, so we're using a 50 millimeter to help get wider.
I should blackmail the hell out of you.
I'm hoping you won't.
Let's view the cut.
Just for the record, I didn't come on to you. You came on to me.
I most certainly did not.
Did too.
Did not.
Did too.
We can't handle this like babies, Anthony.
What's there to handle?
You know just as well as I that this can never happen.
You didn't like it?
I didn't say I didn't like it.
You didn't act like someone who didn't like it?
Anthony, I need you to not tell anyone about this.
Why not?
You just can't.
You're gonna have to do better than that.
Anthony, I'm happily married. I have 2 children. I'm CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation. This wouldn't look good on my resume.
Well, crap. You should have thought of this a little sooner. Is this some standard corporate procedure? Bring in the up-and-comer, mess around with his feelings, and then issue a gag order? What about me, huh? Where do I fit in?
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, you're sorry, all right. Just for the wrong reasons.
I made a terrible mistake, okay? Anthony, if people find out, I'm ruined. The stock will plummet, I'll be forced to resign, my family will break up, I'll have to sell my house. I'll lose everything. I can't believe that's what you want.
I should blackmail the hell out of you.
I'm hoping you won't.
In this scene, we're with a group of treasure hunters looking for an ancient and priceless statue. Several rivaling teams from around the world have found the same clues and are all looking for it. There's a saying about the statue that anyone who sees it shall die a painful death, and most characters in the story, including this group, saw it before a cave collapse. Helen, the woman, is an archaeology professor brought along for her ability to read inscriptions. She's very logical and finds it hard to believe there's actually a curse. Even so, people are suddenly dying for mysterious reasons, and James, the leader of this team, is inclined to believe that there is a curse, not because of conviction, but because of what he's seen. The blue man is Edward, who's along as a buddy. He always seems to mess things up, and in this scene he's quite drunk. Let's do a read-through. Helen and Edward are sitting close together near the campfire. The forest is getting chilly as night falls.
Why do you think they took off like that?
Probably late for a dentist appointment. But have you ever seen their teeth?
The sound of moving foliage and branches cracking. Helen and Edward turn around, startled. They're relieved to see James emerge from the bushes.
Looks like the German expedition is having some trouble of their own. All their porters have disappeared too.
Don't tell me. The curse.
The curse.
I can't believe it. You are grown human beings. How can you believe in some bloody superstition?
Doesn't it strike you as odd that everybody who's seen the statue is dead?
Except us.
I'm very aware of that fact.
Maybe they just tripped and fell. Look, it's the same with the people who uncovered the Pharaoh's grave. There's always a perfectly sensible explanation.
James gives her a look while he gets some large bullets and begins loading his rifle.
Ooh, look, I'm a big ugly statue. Some guy's been dead for 10,000 years. Fear my wrath. Shh. What?
They hear intense wood cracking from above. Louder and louder. Suddenly, a massive log of rotten wood whooshes down and slams into the ground, scattering the campfire. It becomes darker.
Ah! Holy crap!
James looks intently to Helen.
What? Oh, come on. Branches break all the time.
Edward, I told you not to harass the gods.
Sorry.
What? You can't seriously believe this is caused by a curse? For Christ's sake, Jim, you're a civilized man.
James cocks his rifle.
Not so civilized I've lost my instincts.
James suddenly turns around. A beat. Then gunfire is heard coming from the German camp.
Stay here.
He disappears into the bushes. Helen stands for a moment, then runs after him.
Helen! Come back here! Didn't you hear what he just said?
Edward realizes how dark it is, then runs after them, scared. A thing that could work great for this scene is to base the blocking on slow-moving cameras to create subtle movement in the background of each shot and the feeling that something is happening underneath. That can be hard to do for a long scene like this because there will naturally be times when the framing is better than others. Also, we still need to honor any lines in the scene, and if we're doing a slow sideways track on a character here, talking to a character here, we really can't move beyond this point. This means that we would have to either start or end pretty far away, which could make the framing odd for half of the scene. Another thing we want to do is find ways to shoot through the fire and give the shots on each character the subtle movement of flames in the foreground. We'll solve all this with a particular cheating technique, which we'll look at a little later. For now, let's work out some basic blocking. We'll place Helen and Edward on a couple of rocks near the campfire. There are really rocks scattered all over the scene, but we'll assume that they're props that we can easily move, so we won't try to block around them. After a short while, James walks out from the bushes to stand opposite them. So the general coverage will be reverse shots on each of them. The tracks we'll do will be very long and slow, easily over 2 minutes. But for our purposes here, we want almost no movement, so we'll start both Helen's and Edward's tracks here. In the beginning, James is not in the scene yet, so it doesn't matter that we're over this line. Both these tracks are almost identical, so we'll probably shoot them on the same physical track, but let's draw them separately. The track on James will simply be the opposite. As we cut between these three cameras, we naturally want the background to be moving in the same direction, so we'll have these two move this way and the camera on James the other way. All of these cameras are honoring the lines, which makes it hard to shoot through the fire, but we'll again look at that later. If the characters end up having movement, we'll be able to simply pan with them while slowly tracking, which will allow us to do some extremely long takes and is better for the actors. One specific move that could be interesting to do on James is when he cocks his gun, and then has a dry action hero line. This could be a good start on reveal from the gun up on him and would bring extra emphasis to that line. We could shoot this as a separate take, but we could also simply tilt down on the gun while Helen talks, which is a fairly long line, and then tilt up, which would allow us to do it during the long track without stopping. Some other angles that could be interesting are first of all a master over here, which will again put on a track for a slow push. We're not putting in stop marks because we're not very particular about where the track should start and end. Over in this area, we have lots of ruins and weather-worn relics like a big knocked-over statue here. So let's also create a crane move for the beginning of the scene, where we start here and crane out and down from the statue, revealing Helen and Edward. Another move that could be interesting is when James emerges from the bushes, making a lot of noise. We could make this part of the scene a little more suspenseful by being in this camera as Helen and Edward look in that direction, withholding the source of the noise. And then cut to a camera here as James becomes visible. As he walks over to his first mark, we could then pivot this camera with him, incidentally ending in a keyframe that matches this camera, which could also be useful. These cameras easily cover the first half of the scene, up until the log suddenly slams into the campfire, so let's look at how we're going to cover that part. It would be extremely dangerous to have a real log fall on the campfire, so the shot will probably be done as a live action plate with a 3D log inserted in post. What we need then is a shot that basically has the right camera and character movement, but without the log. We'll do this as a completely separate shot to make post-production easier. We could just start with the camera tilted up in the air, and then follow the imaginary log down on the fire. But let's make a little more of it by starting on Helen and Edward 10 or 20 seconds sooner. As they hear cracking noises above them, we'll quickly tilt sharply up, catch the log, and follow it down onto the fire. We'll assume that the fire is a special effect that can be turned off at that exact moment. After the effect, we'll cut, but we might want to do a full take from this angle as well with the camera already set up. Here it would be logical if all the characters jump backwards. To cover that, let's simply pan each of their tracking shots as we keep tracking slowly. These cameras obviously don't have a log in them, so we can't be in them as the log comes down. But that also means they're very easy to shoot, and we can do the panning on the fly while tracking. At this point, there's a break in the scene as machine gun fire is heard from the German camp, and everyone looks in that direction. For this part, we'll want some cameras up here, which is on the opposite side of the line we're coming from. This is not a problem because as soon as the gunfire is heard, we immediately get two new lines from the attention going to the German camp, and these lines instantly become more dominant. So for a camera on James, we'll simply put in a keyframe here. But we probably don't want to be jumping too much back over the old line, so let's plan on covering Helen and Edward from up here as well. All that happens here is that James says, "Stay here," after which he walks out. A moment later, Helen walks out as well. And Edward has the last line. Instead of putting in a bunch of cameras, let's simply pan the camera on James over on Helen. Then pan with her as she walks out. And hand off to Edward's line where he stands for a bit, then runs after them. Throughout the scene, we've been doing subtle camera moves to get the feeling that something is happening underneath, and towards the end we should actually increase the movement. But simply handing off to Edward and just staying locked will be a little static. So while we're doing the handoff to him, let's track into a keyframe here, which will produce back parallax and a higher sense of urgency. A pattern that's emerging is that these tracks are very similar, so we would probably end up shooting them on the same physical track. But since we're after more movement at the end, let's also connect these two keyframes for when the gunfire is heard. The result is that we track from the last regular dialogue on James over on the new side of the line, which will also produce heavy parallax. This track is now starting to get complicated, and it would be a shame to reshoot the entire take just because we mess up at the end, so let's break it up. A good time to break it is just before James cocks his gun. How this track would then work is that we first do the long and slow part of it, and cut as Helen has her last line. Picking up, we'll then start down on the gun. Tilt up, and as gunfire is heard, suddenly track over here. James walks out. We pan over on Helen, and pan with her leaving as we start to track, handing off to Edward while we keep tracking. This move will need a couple of takes before we get it right, but it could be very rewarding. Let's look at the takes. This is a dark scene, so it can be a little hard to make out the cameras. The two cameras on Helen and Edward are shown with these two tracks, although it would make sense to actually lay separate tracks. This camera is the track on James. This camera is the slow tracking wide shot. This camera is the one that pivots with James when he emerges from the bushes, ending up matching the wide shot. And this camera is the lock shot for following the imaginary log. Let's start by getting the opening crane move out of the way. For this shot, the crane could just as easily be stationary, but we want the move to push at the same time to bring us into the scene and not simply stand outside of it. Pushing the base also helps avoid the circular motion of the crane. This move is before the dialogue really begins, so we would need to decide what Helen and Edward are doing. We could either make up some arbitrary chit-chat, which we would play at a lower volume, or we could just have them sit and enjoy the campfire. Either would work. The plans have been purposefully arranged to give us more parallax. For the slow tracks on each of the characters, we want to be shooting through the fire as much as possible. This is easiest with the tracks on Helen and Edward because we can start over the line in the beginning when James is not yet in the scene, and also because there's only one character on James's side. The purpose of tracking slowly is to get subtle movement in the background. But we're only tracking a couple of feet over several minutes, so we're moving extremely slowly, and it's the long focal length that makes it work. When the imaginary log falls down, we'll simply pan to follow their movement, but if we mess up, we can always do a pickup. A thing to notice is that in this scene, we're doing a single move to cover the entire dialogue. If we wanted to move any faster, we could easily either run out of track, cross a line, or get a bad framing. In that situation, we would instead do the desired move for the first half of the scene, back up, and do an identical move for the second half of the scene. For these tracks, we'll play the entire takes, in case you want to load them into an editing system and experiment with different editing. But the dialogue is the same in each take, and you might want to fast forward after a while.
Why do you think they took off like that?
Probably late for a dentist appointment. Have you ever seen their teeth?
Looks like the German expedition is having some trouble of their own. All their porters have disappeared too.
Don't tell me. The curse.
The curse.
I can't believe it. You're grown human beings. How can you believe in some bloody superstition?
Doesn't it strike you as odd that everybody who's seen the statue is dead?
Except us.
I'm very aware of that fact.
Maybe they just tripped and fell. Look, it's the same with the people who uncovered the Pharaoh's grave. There's always a perfectly sensible explanation.
Ooh, look, I'm a big ugly statue. Some guy's been dead for 10,000 years. Fear my wrath. Shh. What? Ah! Holy crap!
What? Oh, come on. Branches break all the time.
Edward, I told you not to harass the gods.
Sorry.
What? You can't seriously believe this is caused by a curse? For Christ's sake, Jim, you're a civilized man.
The take on Edward is essentially the same, except it's easier to get the fire in the foreground because he's more to the right.
Why do you think they took off like that?
Probably late for a dentist appointment. Have you ever seen their teeth?
Looks like the German expedition is having some trouble of their own. All their porters have disappeared too.
Don't tell me. The curse.
The curse.
I can't believe it. You're grown human beings. How can you believe in some bloody superstition?
Doesn't it strike you as odd that everybody who's seen the statue is dead?
Except us.
I'm very aware of that fact.
Maybe they just tripped and fell. Look, it's the same with the people who uncovered the Pharaoh's grave. There's always a perfectly sensible explanation.
Ooh, look, I'm a big ugly statue. Some guy's been dead for 10,000 years. Fear my wrath. Shh. What? Ah! Holy crap!
What? Oh, come on. Branches break all the time.
Edward, I told you not to harass the gods.
Sorry.
What? You can't seriously believe this is caused by a curse?
Moving on to the slow tracking wide shot, we'll be pushing instead of tracking sideways. We're again only tracking a few feet over several minutes, but pushing won't result in any movement in the background. So we've made sure to get some plants directly in the foreground, or the camera would seem to be standing still. There's no point in spending the track on rolling in the beginning, since we already have the crane in the other cameras.
Have you ever seen their teeth?
Looks like the German expedition is having some trouble of their own. All their porters have disappeared too.
Don't tell me. The curse.
The curse.
I can't believe it. You're grown human beings. How can you believe in some bloody superstition?
Doesn't it strike you as odd that everybody who's seen the statue is dead?
Except us.
I'm very aware of that fact.
Maybe they just tripped and fell. Look, it's the same with the people who uncovered the Pharaoh's grave. There's always a perfectly sensible explanation.
Ooh, look, I'm a big ugly statue. Some guy's been dead for 10,000 years. Fear my wrath. Shh. What?
As soon as the characters have fanned out, the framing in this shot doesn't really stick together and will cut. The camera that pivots on James as he emerges from the bushes was really only meant to cover that part, but since it matches the previous camera, we might as well keep it rolling in the ending position. It's a lock camera though, and we'll find out in editing whether or not that's distracting to cut with.
Looks like the German expedition is having some trouble of their own. All their porters have disappeared too.
Don't tell me. The curse.
The curse.
I can't believe it. You're grown human beings. How can you believe in some bloody superstition?
Doesn't it strike you as odd that everybody who's seen the statue is dead?
Except us.
I'm very aware of that fact.
Maybe they just tripped and fell. Look, it's the same with the people who uncovered the Pharaoh's grave. There's always a perfectly sensible explanation.
Ooh, look, I'm a big ugly statue. Some guy's been dead for 10,000 years. Fear my wrath. Shh. What?
When the characters have fanned out, it's hard to know which side of the line we're on, and we'll cut. We'll do the shot for the falling log as if the log is real. Even though the shot is a completely separate take, we'll start it on Helen and Edward so it seems a more natural part of the scene. We tilt up to catch the log. Then reverse and accelerate downwards to follow it. Whatever tilt speed we end up with will be the speed of the log, so we have to simulate gravity. Here we're actually tilting a little too slowly, and the log doesn't seem to be falling fast enough. The track on James is where we'll need to cheat if we want to be shooting through the fire. The problem is that in order to get in over the fire, we have to move very close to the line between him and Helen and eventually cross it. The solution is that if we simply make sure that James is always looking to the left, it ultimately doesn't matter where the line actually is because the shot will look right. So throughout the take, we will gradually be crossing the line, but with James's eye line going to the left, nobody will ever know it. This is of course easy to do with a 3D character because he doesn't need the other actors to play off of. In real life, we could have Ellen and Edward walk slowly next to the camera to maintain a correct eye line and help his performance. Especially with Helen having jumped backwards, it's clear that we're over the line, but we're fine because James's eye line still goes to the left. We're breaking the take up here because the ending might require a couple of tries. So starting down on the gun, we tilt up for his last line, and then track over to the keyframe on the new side of the line. He says, "Stay here," then walks out. We pan over to Helen, who walks after him, and we begin tracking as we hand off to Edward, after which he runs after them.
Looks like the German expedition is having some trouble of their own. All their porters have disappeared too.
Don't tell me. The curse.
The curse.
I can't believe it. You're grown human beings. How can you believe in some bloody superstition?
Doesn't it strike you as odd that everybody who's seen the statue is dead?
Except us.
I'm very aware of that fact.
Maybe they just tripped and fell. Look, it's the same with the people who uncovered the Pharaoh's grave. There's always a perfectly sensible explanation.
Ooh, look, I'm a big ugly statue. Some guy's been dead for 10,000 years. Fear my wrath. Shh. What? Ah! Holy crap!
What? Oh, come on. Branches break all the time.
Edward, I told you not to harass the gods.
Sorry.
What? You can't seriously believe this is caused by a curse? For Christ's sake, Jim, you're a civilized man.
Not so civilized I've lost my instincts. Stay here.
Helen! Come back here! Didn't you hear what he just said?
Let's view the cut.
Why do you think they took off like that?
Probably late for a dentist appointment. Have you ever seen their teeth?
Looks like the German expedition is having some trouble of their own. All their porters have disappeared too.
Don't tell me. The curse.
The curse.
I can't believe it. You are grown human beings. How can you believe in some bloody superstition?
Doesn't it strike you as odd that everybody who's seen the statue is dead?
Except us.
I'm very aware of that fact.
Maybe they just tripped and fell. Look, it's the same with the people who uncovered the Pharaoh's grave. There's always a perfectly sensible explanation.
Ooh, look, I'm a big ugly statue. Some guy's been dead for 10,000 years. Fear my wrath. Shh. Alright. Ah! Holy crap!
What? Oh, come on. Branches break all the time.
Edward, I told you not to harass the gods.
Sorry.
What? You can't seriously believe this is caused by a curse? For Christ's sake, Jim, you're a civilized man.
Not so civilized I've lost my instincts. Stay here.
Helen! Come back here! Didn't you hear what he just said?
As a last topic, let's look at adjusting the blocking for various release formats. Throughout the course, we've been working in a television aspect ratio, which is 4:3, which means that if the screen is 4 wide, it's 3 tall. This is also called 1:33:1. Some other standard release formats are first of all widescreen high-definition TV at 16:9, which again means that if the frame is 16 wide, it's 9 tall, resulting in an aspect ratio of 177:1. For theatrical releases, the two main standards are first of all 185:1, which provides a degree of widescreen without straying too much from a TV aspect ratio, and CinemaScope at 235:1, which is far wider than it is tall, creating the most impressive image and is used for any major release that wants to convey a sense of scale. In addition to this, there are what seems like a million different ways to position and scale the image onto the film, like Super 35, which uses the entire frame of film, Academy Aperture, which is smaller to make room for an optical soundtrack, having the image be 4 perforation marks tall, or 3, and so forth. But without getting into that, what we're concerned with in this chapter is whether the image is shot straight or anamorphic. We'll get to anamorphic in a moment. Film started out as having basically the 4:3 aspect ratio, which was decided to be the most pleasing and generic ratio, and when television was invented, the same ratio was used. All other formats are in one way or another based on this aspect ratio, and whether we're shooting TV widescreen or theatrical widescreen, we're really always shooting a 4:3 image and matting out the parts we don't want to use. When shooting 185:1, we then have a 185 ground glass in the viewfinder to know what we're framing for. And in a post process, this same area is optically matted out completely so it doesn't appear in the prints. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a desire for film to be different from television, and anamorphic lenses were used to create a much wider widescreen. Anamorphic lenses squeeze the image horizontally, usually by a factor of 2:1. So we're able to squeeze a much wider image onto the film. And what is recorded on film uses the whole frame for maximum resolution, although it of course has to be unsqueezed again during projection. In theory, this should produce an aspect ratio of 266:1, twice as wide as television, but for technical reasons it ends up as 235:1. Actually, this is now technically 240:1, but is usually still mentioned as 235:1. The other way to create scope is to simply shoot a 4:3 frame and then extract the part we want to use. With a format such as Super 35 that uses the whole frame because there's no soundtrack, this still produces a resolution that's acceptable. The two standards for what to extract are off-centered, which extracts the part near the top, and centered, which extracts the part in the middle. From a technical perspective, anamorphic is harder to work with because it needs more light and produces less depth of field. Visual effects are also much more difficult to do on anamorphic images. But the most important consideration is framing. In 235, the vertical framing is far more important than the horizontal framing. So if we end up with the framing slightly off horizontally, we can live with it. But if we end up with a bad vertical framing, it immediately sticks out. And moreover, if we're shooting anamorphic, we're stuck with it. We don't have this problem if we're shooting a full Super 35 aperture and simply matting out. All we would then do is slide the underlying frame upwards or downwards, which has the same effect as tilting because there's no parallax. This can be such a lifesaver that it by itself is reason enough to shoot matted scope instead of anamorphic. But it also means that we have permission to be more sloppy about vertical framing because we can tweak it in post. The main concern when shooting is to expect that we want to use the parts outside the frame and not have things like lights and microphones go right to the vertical edge. If we did that, we would have no freedom to reframe. Another concern when framing scope is to make sure to keep all characters' eyes at much more the same level in the frame. In this shot from the Master Push chapter, all eye levels are far apart. If this is meant to be a 235 shot, it's almost impossible to find a good place to frame it, and somebody will have to stick out the top or out the bottom, and it's something to look out for because reframing can't help it. But a scene that is framed with consistent eye levels, like the Not a Suspect scene, converts very easily to 235. So as we play through it again, the only thing we're doing is reframing vertically on a shot-by-shot basis. And this is what it would look like if we had shot it for scope to begin with.
Paging Dr. Statement. Dr. Statement, please.
Michael Crawford, 340. Michael Crawford, please call 340.
Saul, they refused me at the door. You know, I was told to be here this morning and...
Who refused you?
Hoskin and Slater.
Sorry, Henry. You know that Slater has the final word.
But why? I passed all the tests. It's preposterous at this point to assume I pose any danger.
We can't take any chances, Henry.
I didn't cause it, Saul.
You've got to understand that this is a routine investigation. It's not about you personally.
Then why am I not in there operating right now?
Nobody suspects you, Henry.
What did you just do?
What?
That's my patient, nurse. You better have a damn good reason for what you just did.
I was taking the patient's pulse.
No, you were giving her something.
Just her vitamins.
Tell me what you gave her.
Nothing. Just the vitamins.
Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the whole thing.
What is going on in here?
Nothing, Dr. Solomon.
I caught her giving something to my patient.
Only vitamins, Dr. Solomon. Just the daily routine.
Give me the bottle. Aha, no label.
Henry.
I'm sorry, I thought... Sorry, nurse, will you please excuse me?